The day the doctor said the word, cancer, my husband did not hold my hand. He looked at his phone. I remember that moment more clearly than I remember my own wedding day. The white walls of the small clinic room. The soft hum of the air conditioner. The doctor's voice, careful and slow, like she was trying not to break something fragile. And Daniel, my husband of 6 years, sitting 2 feet away from me, scrolling through something on his screen, like I had just told him the weather forecast. I want you to remember that image, because everything that happens next in this story grows out of that one silent, empty moment. My name is Sarah. At the time this story begins, I was 34 years old. I had a small graphic design business I had built from nothing, a husband I loved more than I loved myself, and a mother-in-law, Margaret, who I had spent 6 years trying to please. I thought I had a family. I thought I had a life that, while not perfect, was solid, real, something that would hold me up when I needed it most. I was wrong. 3 weeks after that appointment, my husband packed a bag and walked out the front door of our home while I was still recovering from my first round of treatment. He did not shout. He did not fight. He simply said, "I can't do this," and left. And when I called his mother that night, sobbing, begging her to talk sense into her son, to remind him of his vows, of the years we had built together, she said something I will never forget as long as I live. She said, "Sarah, honestly, I think this was the right decision." The right decision. As if I were a business deal gone bad. As if my illness were an inconvenience that needed to be managed, not a woman fighting for her life who needed her husband beside her. I hung up the phone that night and sat alone in a dark kitchen, wondering how 2 people who had once sworn to love me could look at my suffering and simply walk away from it. But here is what neither Daniel nor Margaret understood in that moment. They thought they were closing a chapter. They thought they were free of me. Free of the burden I had apparently become. What they did not know is that they had just planted a seed. A seed of quiet, controlled, unstoppable resolve. Because I did not just survive that diagnosis. I survived Daniel. I survived Margaret. And eventually, I built something so strong, so undeniable, that both of them would come back into my life one day. Not to comfort me, but to ask me for something. And when that day came, I would remember exactly how it felt to be left alone, in a cold clinic room, with no one holding my hand. This is the story of how I lost everything I thought mattered, and found something far more powerful in its place. This is the story of how betrayal, if you survive it, can become the very fuel that rebuilds you into someone your old life could never have imagined. Stay with me, because what happened next will show you that sometimes the cruelest moment of your life is actually the beginning of the only life worth living. Let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to before the diagnosis, before the silence, before I understood what my marriage really was. 6 years earlier, I met Daniel at a friend's engagement party. He was charming in the easy way some men are. Quick smile, quicker jokes, the kind of confidence that made a room feel warmer when he walked into it. I was 28, freelancing as a graphic designer, still figuring out whether I could actually make a living doing something I loved. Daniel worked in sales for a mid-sized company, and he had a way of making me feel like the most interesting person in any conversation. We married 2 years later, in a small ceremony with just close family and friends. His mother, Margaret, gave a toast that day about how she had always wanted a daughter, and how happy she was to welcome me into the family. I believed every word of it. I did not yet understand that some people are wonderful performers when the audience is watching, and someone else entirely when it isn't. The first few years of our marriage were, by most measures, good. We rented a small apartment, then eventually bought a modest house in the suburbs. My design business slowly grew. First a few local clients, then small businesses across the state. Then eventually a handful of larger contracts that let me hire a part-time assistant. I was proud of what I had built. I was proud of the life we were building together. But looking back now, with the clarity that only distance and pain can give you, I can see the small cracks that were always there. Daniel was a man who needed things to be easy. When conversations got difficult, he changed the subject. When I was stressed about a client deadline, he would say things like, "Just don't think about it too much," instead of asking how he could help. He was not a bad man in any obvious way. He was simply a man who had never been asked to be strong for anyone but himself. Margaret, his mother, was a different kind of presence in my life. She was warm on the surface. She remembered my birthday. She complimented my cooking. She sent thoughtful texts on holidays. But underneath that warmth was something colder, something I only began to recognize in small moments. The way she would gently correct how I organized my kitchen when she visited. The way she would say things like, "Daniel has always needed someone patient," as though she were warning me, or perhaps warning herself, about what her son truly needed from a wife, someone who would absorb his weaknesses without complaint. I did not see these things clearly back then, because I loved them both. I wanted a family. I had lost my own parents years earlier. My mother to illness when I was in college, my father a few years after that, quietly, in his sleep. And Daniel's family had felt, at the time, like the family I had been missing. I poured myself into being the perfect daughter-in-law, the perfect wife. I learned Margaret's recipes. I remembered her doctor's appointments. I supported Daniel through 2 job changes, cheering him on even when his choices set us back financially. I told myself that love meant showing up fully, even when it wasn't reciprocated in equal measure. I told myself that eventually, my effort would be seen. Then, in the spring of what should have been our 7th year together, I found a small lump during a routine self-check. I remember standing in the bathroom, running my fingers over that spot again and again, trying to convince myself it was nothing. I told Daniel about it that same night, and he squeezed my shoulder and said, "I'm sure it's fine. You worry too much." It was such a small, dismissive comment, but I clung to it anyway, because I wanted to believe him. I made an appointment the following week. The doctor ordered tests, and 2 weeks after that, sitting in that small clinic room I described earlier, I heard the word that would divide my life into 2 parts: before and after. Before, I was a woman building a business, nurturing a marriage, trying to earn a place in a family that had never fully been hers to keep. After, I would learn exactly who stood beside me, and who did not. The conflict that was about to unfold was not simply Daniel choosing to leave. It was the slow, painful realization that the family I thought I had built with my own hands, brick by brick, year by year, had never truly been built on solid ground at all. The days after my diagnosis moved in a strange, slow blur. There were more appointments, more tests, more conversations with doctors about treatment plans and timelines and odds. I remember very little of the medical details from those first weeks. What I remember, with painful clarity, is watching my husband slowly disappear. Not physically, not yet, but emotionally, piece by piece. Like a light dimming in a room you didn't realize was going dark. At first, Daniel tried. Or at least, he performed the motions of trying. He came to the first oncology appointment. He sat in the waiting room, checking his phone every few minutes, but he was there. He asked surface-level questions about my treatment schedule. He told his coworkers I was dealing with some health stuff. But I began to notice that his questions were never really about me. They were about how this would affect him. How long will you need to rest? Became, how long until things go back to normal? What does the treatment involve? Became, will you still be able to work? I remember one night, about 10 days after the diagnosis, sitting on the edge of our bed after an exhausting day, and Daniel walked in and said, quite plainly, This is a lot, Sarah. I didn't sign up for this. I sat there in silence, stunned, waiting for him to explain that he was scared. That he didn't mean it the way it sounded. That of course he would be there for me no matter what. He didn't say any of that. He just repeated it, quieter this time, almost to himself. I didn't sign up for this. I want to pause here and say something important. Illness does not just test the sick person. It tests everyone around them. It reveals character in a way that easy, comfortable years rarely do. Some people rise. Some people run. And in those weeks, I watched my husband do the second one, slowly, in increments so small, I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. Margaret's visits during this time were their own kind of quiet cruelty. She would come over, bring a casserole, sit with me for an hour, and somehow, in the middle of every visit, find a way to mention how hard this must be for Daniel too. She would say things like, "He's not built for this kind of stress, you know. He's always been the sensitive one in the family." As if my cancer diagnosis was something happening to him, and I was simply the unfortunate location where it was occurring. I tried, in those weeks, to talk to Daniel honestly. I told him I was scared. I told him I needed him beside me, not perfect, not fixing everything, just present. I remember saying, "I don't need you to have all the answers. I just need you to not disappear." He nodded when I said it. He even hugged me. But 2 days later, he told me he had signed up for extra shifts at work. To keep his mind busy, he started coming home later. He stopped asking about my appointments altogether. I started going to chemotherapy sessions alone, sitting in a room full of quiet, exhausted strangers, all of us hooked to machines, while my husband sent a text asking if I could handle dinner tonight, because he was tired from work. I remember one specific appointment. My 4th treatment session, where a nurse named Carol, who had grown familiar with my case by then, gently asked if my husband would be joining me that day. I told her he was busy with work. She gave me a look I will never forget. Not pity exactly, but a kind of quiet, professional concern. The look of someone who had seen this particular pattern many times before and knew exactly what it usually meant. She squeezed my hand before starting the IV and said, "You're doing great on your own. Some people just aren't ready for this kind of thing." I did not know at the time how prophetic that small kindness would turn out to be. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people and still feeling completely alone. I had Daniel physically in the house some nights. I had Margaret checking in with her casseroles and her comments. But I had never in my life felt more unseen. The final unraveling happened about 3 weeks into my treatment. I had just finished a session that had left me nauseated and shaking, and I called Daniel to ask if he could pick me up, since I wasn't sure I could safely drive myself home. He didn't answer. I called twice more. Nothing. I ended up calling a rideshare. Sitting in the back seat of a stranger's car, silently crying, while the driver glanced at me nervously in the rearview mirror and asked if I was okay. When I got home, Daniel was there, sitting on the couch, phone in hand. I asked him why he hadn't answered. He looked up at me, and for the first time in weeks, he looked me directly in the eyes. And he said the words that would end our marriage, though I didn't fully understand it yet. "Sarah, I think we need to talk about what's actually going on here." I sat down across from him, my body still weak from treatment, and braced myself for a conversation I somehow already knew was coming. This was the turning point. This was the moment the conflict that had been quietly building for weeks was finally about to become undeniable. What he said next would change the entire shape of my life. Daniel did not raise his voice. That was, in some strange way, the most painful part of it. He spoke calmly, almost rehearsed, like he had practiced these words in his head many times before finally saying them out loud to me. He told me that he loved me, but that he wasn't strong enough for what I was going through. He told me that watching me suffer was destroying him emotionally. He told me that he needed to take care of himself before he could take care of anyone else. And then he said the sentence that I have replayed in my mind more times than I can count. I think it's better if I move out for a while. Just until things settle. Just until things settle. As if cancer were a passing storm, something with a fixed and predictable end date. Something you could simply wait out from a safe distance. As if I did not need him precisely because things were not settled. As if my worst moment was an inconvenient season he could skip and rejoin later once the difficult part was over. I remember asking him, my voice shaking, "You're leaving me now? Well, I'm sick." And he looked away from me, toward the window, and said quietly, "I'm not leaving you. I just need space." 3 days later, he packed 2 suitcases and left. He did not take much: some clothes, his laptop, a box of things from his side of the closet. He told me he would be staying with a friend, for now. He kissed my forehead before he left. An act so strange and hollow in that moment that I stood frozen in the doorway, long after his car had pulled out of the driveway. I called Margaret that same night. I don't know exactly what I expected. Comfort, maybe. Or at the very least some acknowledgement that what her son had done was wrong. Instead, I got something far colder. She answered the phone gently at first, asking how I was feeling. But when I told her, through tears, what Daniel had done, her tone shifted. She sighed, the kind of sigh that carries judgment inside it, and said, "Sarah, I know this is hard to hear, but I think Daniel made the right decision." I remember gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "The right decision," I repeated, barely able to get the words out. "I have cancer, Margaret. I need him." "I understand that," she said, her voice maddeningly even. "But you have to understand, this has been incredibly hard on him too. He's not built for this kind of pressure. Some men just aren't. It doesn't make him a bad person. It makes him honest about his limits." I asked her, my voice breaking, how she could defend him abandoning his sick wife. And she said something that, even now, years later, still echoes in my mind with a kind of disbelief. "You'll get through this, Sarah. You're strong. Daniel isn't. I have to protect my son too. Protect her son." As though I were the threat. As though my illness was something being done to Daniel, rather than something happening to me, in my own body, in my own fight for survival. I sat alone in my house that night, still weak from treatment, surrounded by silence so complete it felt like it had weight. I thought about the 6 years I had spent trying to be a good wife, a good daughter-in-law. I thought about every holiday I had helped Margaret cook for. Every argument I had smoothed over between her and Daniel. Every ounce of loyalty I had given to a family that had, in my most desperate moment, decided I was expendable. And somewhere in that silence, something inside me shifted. I want to be honest with you about what that shift felt like, because it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a moment of fiery rage or a scene from a movie. It was quiet. It was almost peaceful, in a strange, sad way. It was the feeling of a door closing softly, permanently, somewhere deep inside me. I stopped waiting for Daniel to come back. I stopped hoping Margaret would call and apologize. I understood, with a clarity that felt almost like relief, that I was now completely on my own. And that being on my own was not the tragedy I had feared it would be. It was simply the truth I now had to build my life around. I did not know it yet, but that night was the true beginning of my recovery. Not just from cancer, but from a life spent shrinking myself to fit into other people's comfort. And it was the beginning, too, of something Daniel and Margaret never saw coming. Because while they walked away believing they had made the right decision, they had no idea what kind of woman they were about to leave behind to rebuild herself from nothing. The months that followed were the hardest of my life, and I will not pretend otherwise. Because there is no version of this story where I want to lie to you about how difficult it was. I went through the remainder of my treatment largely alone. I drove myself to appointments when I could, and called ride-shares when I couldn't. I sat through long, exhausting sessions with strangers around me, and came home to an empty house that still smelled faintly like a marriage that no longer existed. But here is something I learned during those months. Something I want you to hold on to, if you are ever standing where I once stood. Being alone and being lonely are not the same thing. For the first time in years, I began to notice a strange, unfamiliar sensation underneath the pain and the exhaustion. It was the quiet dignity of relying entirely on myself and discovering that I did not break. A close friend from college, someone I had drifted from during my marriage because Daniel had never particularly liked her, reached out after hearing what had happened. Her name was Priya, and she showed up at my door one evening with soup and a fierce, protective anger in her eyes that I hadn't seen directed on my behalf in years. She sat with me while I cried. She drove me to 2 of my remaining treatments. She reminded me, gently but firmly, of who I had been before I had spent 6 years trying to earn a place in someone else's family. Slowly, in small pieces, I began to rebuild. My design business, which I had let quietly shrink during the chaos of my diagnosis, became something I returned to with a strange new focus. I found that during the long hours of chemotherapy, sitting still with nothing but my own thoughts, I would sketch out logo concepts and website layouts in a small notebook just to keep my mind occupied. It became a form of therapy. It became proof, small and steady, that I was still capable, still creative, still someone with something valuable to offer the world, even as my body fought to heal itself. 6 months into my recovery, once my treatment had finished, and my scans came back clear, I made a decision that surprised even me. I decided to fully commit to my business, not as a side project I fit around a marriage, but as the center of a new life I was building on my own terms. I reached out to old clients. I redesigned my portfolio. I raised my rates, something I had always been too afraid to do when I was trying to keep the peace at home, worried about upsetting a fragile financial balance that had, in truth, always favored Daniel's comfort over my own growth. The divorce, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. Daniel did not fight for the house. He did not fight for much of anything, actually, which told me everything I needed to know about how easily he had already mentally moved on. I later learned, through a mutual friend, that Daniel had begun seeing someone new within a few months of leaving. A coworker named Lisa, someone who, from what I heard, was drawn to his easy charm the same way I once had been, without yet knowing what lay beneath it. I remember the day the divorce was finalized. I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot for a long time afterward, not crying, just breathing. I felt something I had not expected to feel, not devastation, but a strange, clean kind of freedom. I was 35 years old. I had survived cancer. I had survived abandonment. I had survived the particular cruelty of a mother-in-law who valued her son's comfort over my survival. And I was still standing. Over the next 2 years, my business grew in ways I had never imagined possible. What started as freelance design work slowly became something bigger. I partnered with another designer, then hired my first full-time employee, then a second. We began taking on larger corporate clients. I remember the day I signed a contract with a mid-sized regional company that would triple my previous annual revenue, and thinking, almost with disbelief, that this version of my life had once seemed impossible to imagine while I was married to Daniel. Not because he had ever explicitly held me back, but because I had spent so much of my energy trying to be small enough, easy enough, low maintenance enough to keep a fragile peace. Freedom, I realized, had given me back the parts of myself I had slowly handed away, year after year, without even noticing I was doing it. I remember one particular evening, about a year into rebuilding my business, that stands out clearly in my memory. I had just closed a deal with a client I had chased for months. A small chain of boutique hotels looking to completely rebrand their visual identity across a dozen locations. It was, at that point, the single biggest contract I had ever landed. I sat in my small home office after the call ended, and instead of immediately calling anyone to celebrate, I simply sat there in silence for a long moment, letting the feeling wash over me. There was a time, not long before, when my first instinct after any success would have been to call Daniel, to seek his approval, to watch his face for some sign that he was proud of me. That instinct, I realized in that quiet moment, was finally gone. I did not need him to validate what I had built. I did not need Margaret to acknowledge it either. The joy I felt was entirely my own, untethered from anyone else's reaction to it, and that feeling was more valuable to me than the contract itself. I called Priya instead, and we celebrated over takeout at my kitchen table, the same kitchen table where I had once sat alone on the night Daniel told me he was moving out. It felt, in a strange and quiet way, like reclaiming something. That table had once represented the loneliest night of my life. Now it represented the place where I shared good news with someone who had shown up for me, consistently, without ever once making me feel like a burden. Priya became more than a friend during this period. As my business grew too large for me to manage alone, she left her own job in marketing to join me full-time, first handling client relationships, and eventually becoming my operations director. I remember offering her the position and feeling an emotion I hadn't expected. A kind of protective pride. The same instinct Margaret had once claimed only applied to her relationship with Daniel. I understood, watching Priya build a career alongside me, that family had never been about blood or marriage certificates. It had always been about who actually shows up. There were harder days too, of course, because rebuilding a life is never a straight, upward line. There were nights when the loneliness crept back in. Not loneliness for Daniel specifically, but a more general ache. The kind that comes from having once believed you had a life fully mapped out, only to find yourself starting over in your mid-30s with no clear blueprint for what came next. I remember one particular Sunday afternoon, about 8 months after the divorce was finalized, when I sat in my car outside a grocery store and cried for nearly 20 minutes. Triggered by nothing more dramatic than seeing a couple in the parking lot, laughing together while loading groceries into their trunk. Grief, I learned, does not follow a schedule. It arrives uninvited, long after you think you've moved past it, and the only way through it is to let it exist without judging yourself for still feeling it. But even on those harder days, I noticed something had fundamentally changed in me. The sadness no longer came bundled with the belief that something was wrong with me, that I had failed at being lovable enough, worthy enough, easy enough to keep. I had simply loved someone who, when it mattered most, could not meet me where I needed him to be. That was his limitation, not my failure. Understanding that distinction, deeply and completely, took time, more time than I expected. But once I truly believed it, something inside me settled in a way it never had before, not even during the good years of my marriage. By the 2-year mark after my diagnosis, my company had grown enough that I was able to move out of the spare bedroom I had been using as an office and lease a small commercial space downtown. I remember standing in that empty space on the day I signed the lease, sunlight pouring through large windows onto bare concrete floors, imagining desks, employees, a life I was building entirely from the ground up. I thought about the woman who had once sat weak and shaking in a rideshare, crying quietly in the back seat while a stranger drove her home from chemotherapy. I wished, in that moment, that I could somehow reach back through time and tell her what was waiting for her on the other side of that pain. I don't know if she would have believed me. I want to be clear about something here, because this is not simply a story about becoming successful out of spite. What was happening inside me during this time was not about revenge, not yet. It was about survival, and then, slowly, about rediscovery. I was becoming a woman I actually liked. A woman who trusted her own judgment again. A woman who no longer needed anyone's approval to feel whole. But life, as it often does, was not finished with this story. Because 2 years after my divorce, once my business was thriving, once I had built a life that was entirely my own, Daniel and Margaret would resurface. Not out of remorse, but out of need. And what I chose to do in that moment would become the true heart of this story. It was a Tuesday afternoon, almost exactly 2.5 years after Daniel had walked out of our home, when I received a phone call from a number I did not recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. It was Margaret. Her voice on the phone was different than I remembered. Smaller somehow. Less certain. She asked how I was doing, and I answered politely but briefly, waiting to understand why she was actually calling. It did not take long for the real reason to surface. Daniel, she explained, had lost his job about 8 months earlier, after his company underwent a round of layoffs. His relationship with Lisa, the coworker he had left me for, had ended shortly after, apparently unable to survive the financial strain and stress that followed his unemployment. He had moved back in with Margaret temporarily, she said, just to get back on his feet. And now, she explained, carefully, delicately, they were calling because Daniel had heard, through mutual acquaintances, how well my business was doing. He was wondering, Margaret said, her voice tightening slightly, if there might be some kind of position at your company, even something entry-level. He's willing to do anything at this point. I sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the strange, almost surreal shape of this conversation. The woman who had told me, in my darkest hour, that abandoning me was the right decision, was now asking me for a favor for the very son she had defended. I asked her, calmly, why she thought I would want to help Daniel after everything that had happened. There was a pause on the line, and then she said something that revealed, perhaps more honestly than anything she had ever said to me, exactly how she had always seen our relationship. Sarah, family helps family. Whatever happened between you two, we're still connected. You know how much this family means. I remember almost laughing out loud at the audacity of that sentence. Family helps family. A phrase she had never once applied to me during the months I was fighting for my life, alone, uncertain if I would survive to see another year. Family, apparently, was a concept that only mattered to Margaret when it served her. I told her I would think about it, and I ended the call. That evening, I sat with Priya, who by then had become not just a close friend, but essentially a business partner, helping me manage client relationships as my company continued to grow. I told her about the call, and she watched me carefully as I spoke, clearly trying to gauge how I actually felt underneath the calm exterior I was presenting. What are you going to do? She asked. And here is the truth I want to share with you, because I think it matters more than any dramatic act of revenge that might come later in this story. In that moment, sitting with my friend, thinking about Daniel and Margaret's request, I realized something important about myself. I was not interested in destroying them out of anger. That version of revenge, the loud, cruel, vindictive kind, had never actually appealed to me, even in my darkest, angriest moments. What I wanted, I realized, was something quieter and far more powerful. I wanted them to fully understand, in a way they could never again dismiss or excuse, exactly what they had thrown away. I decided to meet with Daniel. I agreed to see him at a coffee shop near my office, a neutral, public space where I felt in control of the environment. I remember watching him walk in, and feeling a strange mixture of emotions I had not expected. Not longing, not anger exactly, but something closer to distant curiosity. like observing a stranger who happened to share a history with a version of myself that no longer existed. He looked older than I remembered. Tired. The easy confidence that had once defined him seemed dimmed. Worn down by months of unemployment, and a relationship that had collapsed under pressure. He apparently hadn't been prepared for either. I noticed small details about him that felt strange to observe from such a distance. A coffee stain on his sleeve he hadn't bothered to notice. The way his hands moved restlessly on the table, tapping a rhythm that used to mean he was nervous. 6 years of marriage teaches you a person's tells, even when that person has become a stranger. I sat there recognizing all of them, and feeling, for the first time, almost nothing in response. He asked, hesitantly, how I had been. I told him honestly that the last 2 years had been the hardest and most transformative of my life. That I had rebuilt not just my business, but my entire understanding of what I deserved from the people around me. He nodded along, and I could see him searching for some opening, some way to steer the conversation toward the real reason he had asked to meet. Lisa and I split up about 4 months ago. He offered, unprompted, as though giving me this information might somehow earn him sympathy, or perhaps context for why he now found himself in this position. It got hard, once I lost the job. She said she needed someone more stable. I remember feeling a strange, distant echo of recognition at those words. Needed someone more stable. A phrase that carried an uncomfortable similarity to things I imagine he might have said about me, in quieter moments, to people who weren't me. I did not point this out. It did not feel necessary. He was, in his own halting way, beginning to understand something about impermanence. About how the things we take for granted in other people's loyalty can disappear. The moment we ourselves become difficult to love. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He thanked me for coming. He told me, somewhat clumsily, how impressive my business had become, how he had always known I was talented. And then, after some hesitant small talk, he finally said what he had really come to say. Sarah, I know I don't deserve this, but is there any chance you'd consider bringing me on, even in a junior role? I really need this. I've been struggling. I looked at him for a long moment, remembering the man who had told me, while I sat weak and shaking from chemotherapy, that he hadn't signed up for this. I remembered calling him from the rideshare, crying, while he sat at home with his phone in his hand. I remembered every single moment of that silence he had left behind in my life. And then I gave him my answer. An answer that would set the final events of this story into motion. An answer that had nothing to do with cruelty. And everything to do with finally, fully closing a door that should have been closed years earlier. I looked at Daniel across that small coffee shop table, and I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not triumph, but a kind of clarity I had been slowly building toward for over 2 years without fully realizing it. Daniel, I said, keeping my voice steady. I'm not going to give you a job. He nodded slowly, his shoulders sinking slightly, as though he had expected this answer but had hoped, somehow, that things might go differently. But I wasn't finished. I want to tell you why, I continued, not to hurt you, but because I think you actually need to hear it, maybe for the first time in your life. I told him about the rideshare home from chemotherapy. Sitting alone in a stranger's car, shaking and nauseated, while he ignored 3 phone calls. I told him about the nights I sat in our kitchen, staring at meals I had no appetite to eat, waiting for a husband who had already emotionally left long before he physically walked out the door. I told him that I understood fear. I understood, better than almost anyone, what it felt like to be terrified of an uncertain future. But I told him that fear is not an excuse to abandon the person who needs you most. Fear is exactly the moment when love is supposed to show up. You didn't just leave me when things got hard, I said. You left me when I needed you the most. And you let your mother tell me it was the right decision. Do you understand what that did to me? Not just the illness. The loneliness of fighting for my life, while the two people who were supposed to love me unconditionally decided I was too much of a burden to bother with. Daniel's eyes were wet by this point. And for a moment I saw something that looked almost like genuine remorse. He told me he had thought about that time more than he had ever admitted to anyone. He told me that watching me get sick had terrified him in a way he hadn't known how to process, and that instead of learning to face that fear, he had simply run from it, the same way, he admitted quietly, he had run from difficult things his entire life. I did not feel satisfaction hearing this. I felt something closer to sadness. Sadness for the young woman who had spent 6 years trying to earn the love of people who were never capable of offering it unconditionally in the first place. I forgive you, Daniel. I told him, and I meant it, because holding on to that anger had never been the thing keeping me strong. My strength had come from something else entirely. From rebuilding my life without needing his validation, without needing Margaret's approval, without needing either of them to ever fully understand what they had done. But forgiving you, I continued, doesn't mean rewarding you. I built this company by myself, during the hardest years of my life, with almost no support from anyone in your family. I'm not going to hand a piece of that to the man who wasn't there when I needed him most. He nodded, quietly, and did not argue. Before I left, I told him one more thing, something I had not planned to say, but that came to me in that moment with startling clarity. You told your mother you weren't built for hard things, I said. But you were. You just chose not to be. There's a difference. I hope, for your sake, you eventually figure that out, because the rest of your life is going to keep asking hard things of you, whether you're ready or not. I stood up, thanked him for his honesty, and left the coffee shop without looking back. A few weeks later, I received one more phone call from Margaret. This time, her tone was different. Less demanding, more uncertain, almost searching for something from me that I don't think she fully understood herself. She asked, somewhat awkwardly, if there was any chance I might reconsider helping Daniel, just this once, for old time's sake. I told her, calmly and without anger, exactly what I had told Daniel. Margaret, you once told me that abandoning me during the hardest fight of my life was the right decision. I've had 2 years to think about that sentence. And I've realized something important. You were right, actually. Just not in the way you meant it. It was the right decision. Because it taught me I never needed either of you to survive. I built an entire life without you. I'm not going to unbuild any part of it now. There was a long silence on the phone before she quietly said goodbye. We have not spoken since. It has been almost 3 years now, since that phone call with Margaret, and I want to close this story by telling you where I am today, and what I have come to understand about everything that happened. My business has continued to grow. What started as a one-woman design operation working out of a spare bedroom is now a company with 12 employees, serving clients across the country. I bought a new house last year, smaller than the one I shared with Daniel, but entirely, completely mine. I filled it with furniture I chose myself. Colors I actually love, a life built around my own preferences rather than someone else's comfort. I am, for the first time in my adult life, completely financially independent, emotionally steady, and surrounded by people. Priya especially, along with a small circle of close friends, and my growing team, who show up for me not because they have to, but because they genuinely want to. I never remarried, though not out of bitterness. I dated occasionally over the years, and eventually found someone I care for deeply, a quiet, steady man named Mark, who runs a small woodworking business 2 towns over. What I appreciate most about our relationship is something I never had with Daniel: consistency. When I catch a cold, He shows up with soup without being asked. When I'm stressed about a client deadline, he asks how he can help instead of asking when I'll be done being stressed. It's a small, unremarkable kind of love, and it is, I have come to understand, exactly the kind of love that actually matters. I think often about that moment in the clinic room, when Daniel looked at his phone instead of holding my hand. For a long time, I saw that moment as the beginning of my greatest tragedy. Now, with years of distance and healing behind me, I see it differently. That moment was, in its own painful way, a gift. It showed me the truth about my marriage, before I had spent decades more of my life invested in something hollow. It forced me to discover a strength inside myself that I never would have found if I had stayed comfortable. If I had stayed protected by a marriage that looked solid on the outside, but had never truly been built to hold weight. Here is what I want you to take from this story, if you take nothing else. Betrayal, especially the kind that comes during your most vulnerable moment, feels at the time like the end of everything. It feels like proof that you are unlovable, that you are too much, that you asked for too much simply by needing help. I want to tell you, clearly and without hesitation, that none of that is true. Needing help during illness, during hardship, during the darkest chapters of your life, is not a flaw. It is simply what it means to be human. The people who cannot meet you, they are not revealing something broken in you. They are revealing something limited in themselves. I also want to say this, because I think it matters just as much as anything else in this story. My revenge, in the end, was never about punishing Daniel or Margaret directly. It was never about grand, dramatic gestures of retaliation. My revenge was simply this: refusing to let their abandonment define the rest of my life. It was building something so strong, so entirely my own, that when they eventually came looking for help, I no longer needed anything from them. Not their approval, not their love, not even their apology. If you are going through something similar right now, if someone you trusted has walked away from you during your hardest moment, if someone has told you that your pain was inconvenient, that your needs were too much, that leaving you was the right decision, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not what happened to you. You are what you choose to build afterward. The people who leave during the storm were never going to be the shelter you needed anyway. Let them go. Grieve what you believed you had, because that grief is real, and it deserves space. But do not mistake their absence for your weakness. Sometimes the very people who abandon us in our darkest hour are unknowingly giving us the push we need to discover exactly how strong we actually are. Sometimes I think about how easy it would have been to let bitterness take over completely. To spend the rest of my life defined by what Daniel and Margaret took from me, rather than what I built afterward. I understand that pull, because I felt it myself in the early days. There is a strange comfort in anger. It gives you something to hold on to, something that feels, at least temporarily, stronger than grief. But anger, if you let it stay too long, has a way of quietly becoming its own kind of prison, keeping you tethered to the very people who hurt you, long after they've stopped thinking about you at all. What finally freed me was not forgiveness in the way people often imagine it. Not a warm, tearful reconciliation, not forgetting what happened. It was simply the slow, deliberate act of building a life so full, so genuinely mine, that Daniel and Margaret became smaller and smaller figures in the story, until eventually they were simply two people who had once been part of my past, rather than forces still shaping my present. I did not choose to get sick. I did not choose to be abandoned. But I did choose what came after. And that choice, more than any diagnosis, more than any betrayal, is what ultimately defined the rest of my life. Thank you for listening to my story. If it moved you in any way, I hope you'll carry this thought with you. The right people will never make you feel like your struggles are a burden. And if you're ever left standing alone, in a moment that should have been shared, remember, you have more strength inside you than you know. Sometimes it takes losing everything to finally find it.